The ground shook as another explosion lit up the sky. Lieutenant Jack Miller pressed himself against a crumbling wall and signaled his squad to hold position. Dust and ash fell like snow around them. This Vordax colony world had once been beautiful, Jack thought. Now it was just another casualty of a war nobody really understood. "Clear the sector and move on," crackled the voice in his helmet. "No survivors reported in this quadrant." Jack nodded to his team. "Split up. Davis and Rodriguez, take the east wing. Sanchez and I will check the west. 20 minutes, then we regroup." The research facility had taken a direct hit during the initial bombardment 3 days ago. Most Vordax had either fled or died. Jack's squad was part of the final sweep before human forces pulled back to their forward operating base. Jack moved carefully through the ruins, his rifle ready. The Vordax weren't known for booby traps, but this war had made everyone unpredictable. He stepped over fallen beams and crushed equipment. The silence felt heavy. A soft sound stopped him. He held up his fist, and Sanchez froze behind him. "You hear that?" Jack whispered. The sound came again. Not mechanical. Not a weapon charging. It sounded like breathing. No, more like whimpering. "Stay alert," Jack said, moving toward a half-collapsed doorway. The room beyond had once been some kind of laboratory. Strange equipment lay shattered across the floor. A section of ceiling had fallen, crushing workstations beneath it. The sound was clearer now. Jack swept his light across the room and found the source. Under a fallen support beam, partially hidden by debris, was a young Vordax. Female, Jack guessed from the purple-tinged skin markings. Not an adult, the Vordax equivalent of maybe 13 or 14 in human years. Her large eyes widened at the sight of him. The Vordax had been painted as monsters in military briefings, but all Jack saw was a terrified child. "Sanchez, watch the door," Jack ordered, slinging his rifle and approaching slowly. The young Vordax tried to push herself deeper under the debris, but her lower body was trapped. Her breathing came fast and shallow. "It's okay," Jack said, knowing she probably couldn't understand him. He held his empty hands out. "I'm not going to hurt you." She watched him, trembling. Jack pointed to the beam pinning her down, then to himself, mimicking a lifting motion. Her 6-fingered hand clutched at something around her neck. Some kind of pendant. "Lieutenant, we should call this in," Sanchez said from the doorway. Jack knew what that meant. Standard procedure was to report any Vordax, secure them, and transfer them to detention facilities for processing. Even children. "Give me a hand first," Jack said instead. "We need to free her." Together, they carefully lifted the beam. The young Vordax pulled herself free, revealing a leg bent at an unnatural angle. She made no sound, but tears leaked from her eyes, violet drops that left faint glowing trails on her cheeks. Jack reached for his med kit. The Vordax flinched. "It's medicine," he said gently. "To help." As he worked to stabilize her leg, Jack noticed a birthmark on her neck, partially hidden beneath the pendant. The pattern reminded him of Lyra, a constellation visible from his hometown in Nebraska. "Lyra," he said, pointing to the mark. "That's what I'll call you. My name is Jack." He tapped his chest. "Jack." Then he pointed to her. "Lyra." The young Vordax blinked slowly. Her breathing steadied. "Lieutenant, we need to report this," Sanchez reminded him. Jack nodded. "We will. But not as a detainee. She's injured and needs medical attention. We're taking her to the refugee center." "That's against protocol." "I know what the protocol says," Jack cut him off. "But she's just a kid, Sanchez." Jack carefully lifted the young Vordax. She was lighter than he expected, her body temperature cooler than a human's. She didn't struggle. "Sometimes," Jack said quietly, "we need to remember why we're fighting this war in the first place. If we can't show mercy, what makes us any different from what they say the Vordax are?" As they made their way out of the ruined building, the alien girl's hand found Jack's medallion hanging from his neck. Her fingers traced the embossed Earth symbol as she looked up at his face, seeing something beyond the helmet and the uniform. A human. The refugee camp sprawled across what had once been farmland. White tents lined up in neat rows, each marked with the blue symbol of the Interstellar Aid Agency. Guards stood at the perimeter, but they wore light blue helmets instead of military green. This was a place of safety, not detention. Jack walked through the camp, nodding at fellow soldiers and aid workers. 2 weeks had passed since he found Lyra in the ruins. He carried a small package under his arm. He found her in the medical tent. Her purple-tinged skin looked brighter now, less ashen. The doctors had set her broken leg with a special cast designed for Vordax physiology. She sat on her cot, watching the entrance as if waiting for someone. When she saw Jack, her large eyes widened. She straightened up and raised one 6-fingered hand in a small wave. "Hello, Lyra," Jack said, sitting on the stool beside her cot. "How are you feeling today?" A translator device sat on the small table between them. The young Vordax picked it up and spoke into it. Her voice was musical, with clicks and trills that human vocal cords could never manage. "Better. Lay hurts less," the device translated in flat tones that failed to capture the melody of her speech. Jack smiled and opened his package. "I brought you something." He pulled out an old-style paper book with colorful pictures. "It's an English-language book. For children, really, but it might help you learn some basic words." Lyra took the book carefully, her 6 fingers delicately turning the pages. She stopped at a picture of the night sky. "Stars," Jack said, pointing. "Stars," Lyra repeated, her pronunciation strange but recognizable. For an hour they looked through the book together. Jack would say the words, and Lyra would repeat them. Sometimes she would speak in her language, and Jack would try to say those words too. They both laughed at his attempts. A doctor came by, checking on patients. "Lieutenant Miller, may I have a word?" Jack nodded and stepped away from Lyra's cot. The doctor looked serious. "We've confirmed she has no living family," the doctor said quietly. "All records show her parents were researchers at that facility. They didn't make it out." Jack looked back at Lyra, who was still examining the book. "What will happen to her?" "The refugee integration program will take over her care. She'll be educated, given a chance at a new life somewhere safe." "Where?" The doctor shook his head. "That depends on politics above my pay grade. There's talk of relocating Vordax refugees across several neutral systems." Jack frowned. The war was winding down. Peace talks had started, but trust between humans and Vordax remained fragile. He returned to Lyra's side. She looked up at him, sensing his mood had changed. "I have to go soon," Jack said, knowing the translator would convey his words but not his regret. "My unit is being called back to Earth." Lyra's face fell. She spoke rapidly into the translator. "When return?" the device asked. Jack sighed. "I don't know if I can. The war is ending, but things are complicated." Tears formed in Lyra's eyes, those strange violet drops that seemed to glow slightly. She spoke again, the translator struggling with her rapid words. "Alum again. Always alone." Jack reached for the medallion hanging around his neck. It was his service medallion, given to him when he graduated from the academy. The Earth was embossed on one side, his name and rank on the other. He removed it and placed the chain around Lyra's neck. "This is important to me," he said. "I want you to have it." He pointed to himself. "I promise I will try to find you again someday." He spoke to the translator. "Can you tell her that humans keep their promises? That this is something we believe in strongly?" The translator conveyed his message in the clicking, musical language of the Vordax. Lyra listened, then clutched the medallion tightly. Before Jack left, he spoke with the aid workers. He arranged for Lyra to receive proper care, education, and support. He filed paperwork to track her placement in the refugee system. He did everything he could. As he walked away from the camp for the last time, Jack looked back. Lyra stood at the entrance of her tent, the medallion gleaming against her purple skin, watching him until he disappeared from view. 10 years passed like a slow river. Jack Miller stood by the tall windows of the Unity Tower in New Washington, watching shuttles come and go from the orbital station. At 35, his face had gained lines around the eyes and mouth. A small scar crossed his right eyebrow. His military uniform had been replaced by the dark blue suit of the security consultant. "Mr. Miller, the delegates are ready for you." Jack turned and nodded at the young assistant. "Thank you, Allison." His job now involved protecting diplomats and trade officials as they moved between worlds. The war had ended 8 years ago. Peace existed on paper, but trust came slower. Inside the meeting room, representatives from 6 different species sat around a curved table. Jack took his position near the door, scanning faces and noting exits. This was routine work, far from the chaos of war. A Vordax delegate sat at the far end of the table. Their purple skin was darker than Jack remembered Lyra's being, with silver markings that indicated advanced age. Jack watched the Vordax carefully. Even after all these years, seeing one brought back memories. Jack had tried to find Lyra. For 3 years after returning to Earth, he sent messages through official channels, tracking refugee placements. But the system was overwhelmed after the war. Records were lost or classified. Eventually, his requests were denied clearance. "Move on," his superior had told him. "The war is over. Let it go." But Jack never stopped wondering. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Trade agreements, mining rights, security protocols, all discussed in the careful language of diplomacy. As delegates filed out, Jack noticed the elderly Vordax watching him with interest. "You were a soldier," the Vordax said in perfect English, approaching Jack directly. Jack nodded. "Lieutenant, 3rd Fleet, sir." "I can tell. You stand like one who has seen battle." The Vordax tilted his head. "My name is Korath. I was a scholar before becoming a diplomat." Jack shook the 6-fingered hand carefully. "Jack Miller, security consultant now. You watched me closely during the meeting," Korath observed. "May I ask why?" Jack hesitated. "I knew someone from your world once. A young girl I found during the final campaigns. I helped her reach a refugee camp." Korath's large eyes blinked slowly. "And you wonder what became of her?" "I do," Jack admitted. "I made her a promise, but I lost track of her in the system." "Many of our young ones were scattered across neutral systems," Korath said. "It was not ideal, but it was survival." "Do you remember her name?" "I called her Lyra. I don't know her Vordax name. She had a birthmark on her neck, shaped like a constellation from Earth." Korath's eyes widened slightly. "Interesting. There is a cultural attaché working on Earth now who came from the colony you described. I met her recently at the embassy. She was a child during the war, rescued by humans." Jack's heart quickened. Could it be the same person? "Do you know where I can find her?" "She works at the Vordax embassy in Old Chicago. Her Vordax name is Zetheria, but she uses a human name as well." Korath paused. "I cannot say if she is your Lyra, but the coincidence is notable." Jack thanked the delegate and left quickly. In his apartment that night, he pulled out a small box from his bedside drawer. Inside was a photograph taken by an aid worker at the refugee camp, Jack kneeling beside a small Vordax girl. He had carried this memory for 10 years. The next morning, Jack requested leave from his supervisor. For the first time in years, he felt something beyond duty and routine. The promise he made long ago had never faded. A journey awaited him. As his shuttle rose toward the Chicago transit hub, Jack wondered if she would remember him, if she still had his medallion, if the scared alien girl had found her place in this complicated universe. He would soon find out. The Vordax embassy in Old Chicago stood out among the steel and glass towers. Its curved walls shifted colors with the changing light, mimicking the famous auroras of the Vordax homeworld. Guards from both species stood at the entrance, a symbol of the fragile peace. Inside, Lyra moved through the grand hall with practiced grace. At 26, she was young for a diplomat by Vordax standards. Her purple skin had deepened to a rich violet with maturity, and silver patterns had begun to appear along her arms, the first signs of adulthood. She wore the formal robes of her position, designed to blend Vordax tradition with Earth fashion. Cultural attaché Cytherea, your next appointment has arrived, her assistant called, using her full Vordax name. Thank you, Ben. Please show them in, Lyra replied in perfect English. Her office overlooked Lake Michigan. The walls displayed art from both worlds, Earth landscapes beside Vordax light sculptures. On her desk sat a small book, worn from years of use, the same picture book Jack had given her long ago. Lyra touched the medallion on her wrist. She had fashioned it into a bracelet, never removing it even after all these years. Sometimes she wondered if the human remembered her, or if she had just been one more refugee in a war that changed everything. A human delegate entered, discussing cultural exchange programs. Lyra listened attentively, making notes and offering suggestions. This was her purpose now, building bridges between species that had once tried to destroy each other. Later that day, Lyra received a message from Ambassador Korth, the senior Vordax diplomat who had mentored her. I met someone interesting yesterday. The message read, a human security consultant who once served in the military. He spoke of rescuing a young Vordax girl during the final campaigns. He called her Lyra. Her 6 fingers froze above the screen. After all these years, could it be? She had searched records when she first arrived on Earth, looking for the soldier named Jack who had saved her. But military files were restricted, and human names were so common. Lyra's assistant entered with a datapad. The Interstellar Coalition has announced a 10-year commemoration of the peace treaty. It will be held in New Geneva next month. All embassy staff are invited to attend. Will there be military personnel there? Lyra asked suddenly. Yes, veterans from both sides. It's meant to symbolize reconciliation. Ben replied, looking confused by her interest. Lyra made her decision quickly. Please inform the ambassador that I volunteer to join our delegation to the commemoration. That night, Lyra stood at her apartment window, looking at the stars. She remembered little of her life before the war. Her parents' faces had faded from memory. But she still saw Jack clearly, the first human who showed her kindness, who treated her as a person rather than an enemy. She remembered how he had taught her words, laughed at his own attempts to speak Vordax, arranged for her care when he had to leave. So many others had helped her over the years. Teachers in the refugee program, mentors in the diplomatic corps. But Jack was the first, the one who gave her hope when everything seemed lost. Lyra touched the medallion again, tracing the outline of Earth embossed on its surface. For years, she had carried this piece of him, this promise. Now there was a chance to find him again. She pulled out an old data box, her few possessions from childhood. Inside was a faded photograph of a young human soldier kneeling beside a small Vordax girl. On the back, someone had written Lieutenant Jack Miller with Refugee, Camp 17. Lyra carefully placed the photo on her bedside table. In 1 month, she would go to New Geneva. She would look for him in the crowd of humans. She would discover if some promises could be kept across years and stars. Sleep came slowly that night, filled with dreams of a ruined building, gentle hands lifting her to safety, and a voice saying, I'll find you again someday. New Geneva sparkled with lights and banners for the peace commemoration. The great dome of the Unity building glowed blue and green at night, the colors of Earth and the Vordax homeworld side by side. Security was tight. Guards checked everyone entering the main plaza. Jack adjusted his suit as he walked through the security checkpoint. His consultant badge got him through quickly. His heart beat faster than normal. After Old Chicago, he had tracked down information about the Vordax cultural attaché named Cytherea. She would be here tonight, part of the official delegation. Could it really be his Lyra? After 10 years. Inside the main hall, hundreds of people from a dozen worlds mingled. Music played softly. Servers carried drinks and small foods from different planets. Jack scanned the crowd, looking for the purple skin of the Vordax. Across the room, Lyra entered with her delegation. She wore formal diplomatic robes in deep blue with silver trim. Her purple skin stood out among the humans. She nodded politely as people greeted her, but her large eyes kept moving, searching the crowd. For an hour, they moved through the hall without seeing each other. Jack spoke with former military colleagues. Lyra discussed cultural programs with Earth officials. The room was too big, too crowded. Then the main ceremony began. Everyone took seats in the great circular chamber. Speeches started. Human leaders, Vordax elders, representatives from neutral worlds that had helped broker peace. They spoke of the war's end, of 10 years of difficult but successful cooperation. Jack sat near the back, still watching for Lyra. The Vordax delegation sat in a special section near the front. From where he sat, Jack could only see the backs of their heads. After the speeches came the reception. People rose and began to mingle again. Jack made his way toward the Vordax delegation. A group of officials surrounded them, making it hard to get close. Lyra felt tired from the formal ceremony. She smiled and nodded at the proper moments, but her mind was elsewhere. She had seen no sign of Jack Miller. Perhaps Ambassador Korath had been mistaken. Perhaps Jack wasn't here after all. She excused herself and walked to a quieter corner of the hall. A server offered her a drink. As she reached for it, the sleeve of her robe pulled back, revealing the medallion bracelet on her wrist. Across the room, Jack turned at the sound of familiar laughter. A human diplomat was speaking with a female Vordax. Something about her posture caught his attention. The way she tilted her head slightly when listening. Then she reached for a drink, and light flashed off something on her wrist. Jack moved closer, making his way through the crowd. The female Vordax turned slightly, and he saw her profile. A pattern on her neck, just visible above her collar. Like a constellation. Like Lyra. At that moment, she sensed someone watching her. Lyra turned and saw a human man staring at her from a few meters away. He had a short beard now, and his face had aged, but something about his eyes. Their gazes met across the crowded room. For a moment, neither moved. 10 years fell away. They were back in a ruined building, a scared girl and a kind soldier. Jack took a step forward. Lyra did the same. They moved slowly toward each other, people moving around them like water around stones in a stream. Lyra, Jack said softly when they were close enough. She touched the medallion on her wrist. Jack, you kept your promise. Something passed between them. Recognition, wonder, the weight of 10 years of separate lives. I tried to find you, he said. For years. I looked for you too, she replied. When I came to Earth. Around them, the commemoration continued. Officials made toasts. Music played. But for Jack and Lyra, the crowded room had narrowed to just the two of them, a bubble of quiet in the noise. We have much to talk about, Jack said. Lyra nodded. Yes, but not here. There are too many people, too many protocols. Tomorrow then, once the formal events are done. Yes, Lyra said. Tomorrow. 10 years of waiting would need more than a few stolen moments in a crowded hall. The gardens behind the Unity building were quiet the next afternoon. Water trickled in small streams between flowering plants from a dozen worlds. Stone paths wound through trees with blue and green leaves. Few people came here during the busy commemoration events. Jack arrived early, finding a bench near a small pond. He wore casual clothes today. No security badge, no formal suit. Just a man waiting to meet an old friend. He had hardly slept. Questions kept running through his mind. What would they say to each other? What had her life been like? Would she remember the scared young girl she once was? Lyra approached along the stone path. She too had changed from her formal robes to simpler clothing, a light tunic and pants in the Earth style, though designed for Vordax physiology. She had requested time away from her delegation, claiming a need for rest. It wasn't exactly a lie. Jack stood when he saw her. For a moment, They just looked at each other in the clear daylight. Then Lyra stepped forward and did something unexpected. She held out her hand in the human way of greeting. Jack took her 6-fingered hand carefully. "I wasn't sure you would come. I've waited 10 years for this meeting," Lyra said. Her English was perfect now, with only a slight musical quality to mark it as non-native. "I wouldn't miss it." They sat on the bench, an arm's length apart. Around them, the garden was peaceful. Birds from Earth sang in the trees. "You speak English very well," Jack said. Lyra smiled. "I had a good first teacher, and I kept practicing. I wanted to come to Earth someday." She turned her wrist, showing the medallion she had fashioned into a bracelet. "I kept this safe. It reminded me that some humans are kind, even during war." Jack's eyes grew warm with emotion. "I kept looking for you for years. The refugee program records were a mess. Eventually, they stopped letting me search. I did the same when I first came to Earth," Lyra said. "Military records are very protected. I could find no trace of Lieutenant Jack Miller. I left the military 5 years ago," Jack explained. "I couldn't stay in that life. Not after everything I saw. Especially not after meeting you." A comfortable silence fell between them. Then they both started speaking at once, laughed, and stopped. "Please," Jack said, "tell me about your life. How did you go from refugee to diplomat?" Lyra looked at the peaceful garden around them. "The refugee program sent me to Proxima Colony. I lived with a mixed family, 2 Vordax adults, and their adopted human child. They were educators. They taught me that boundaries between species can be crossed." She touched the birthmark on her neck, the pattern that had given her the name Lyra. "I studied human languages and Vordax history. I wanted to understand why we fought, how we could find peace. When the diplomatic corps began recruiting Vordax who understood humans, I applied immediately." Jack nodded. "You wanted to build bridges." "Yes, just as you did for me once." Lyra turned to face him fully. "And you? What has your life been?" Jack looked down at his hands. "After the war, I stayed in the military for a while. But my heart wasn't in it anymore. I started working security for peace conferences. I wanted to protect the talks, make sure the war never started again." He smiled slightly. "I guess we both found ways to serve peace." "Because of that day," Lyra said softly, "when you found me in the ruins. I often wondered if I did enough," Jack admitted. "If you were safe, happy." Lyra's large eyes held his gaze. "You changed my life, Jack Miller. You showed mercy when others might not have. Everything I am began with that moment." Jack swallowed hard against the emotion rising in his throat. "I'm glad I found you again, Lyra." "Zytheria," she said. "My full Vordax name is Zytheria. But I kept Lyra as well. It was the first gift you gave me." As afternoon light filtered through the blue-green leaves above them, human and Vordax sat together, beginning to bridge the 10-year gap between rescue and reunion. News traveled fast in diplomatic circles. By the next morning, people were talking about the Vordax cultural attaché and the human security consultant seen walking together in the gardens. Someone had taken pictures. By afternoon, those pictures appeared on news feeds across 3 planets. Jack saw the headlines on his screen when he woke up. "War enemies reunite. Human soldier and Vordax refugee find each other after 10 years. Another read, Peace Treaty Anniversary produces unexpected reunion." His comm unit beeped with an urgent message from his supervisor. "Report to headquarters immediately. Security clearance under review." Across the city in the Vordax delegation quarters, Lyra faced similar trouble. Ambassador Korath showed her the news reports with concern in his large eyes. "Some conservative factions are questioning your loyalty," he said gently. "They say you are too close to humans. They want you recalled to the homeworld." Lyra stood tall. "I have done nothing wrong. Jack Miller saved my life during the war. We met by chance at the commemoration." "I believe you," Korath said, But politics is rarely about truth. It is about perception, and the perception now is complicated. Later that day, Jack and Lyra met at a small cafe away from the main diplomatic areas. They sat at a corner table, aware of the glances from other customers. "My security clearance is under review," Jack said quietly. "They think I might have shared classified information with you." Lyra nodded. "My position is also in danger. Some Vordax believe I cannot be trusted around humans." A heaviness settled between them. The joy of their reunion was being poisoned by old fears, old hatreds. "Perhaps we should not meet again until the commemoration ends," Lyra suggested, though the word hurt to say. Jack shook his head. "That would only confirm their suspicions. We've done nothing wrong." Before they could decide what to do, a young human reporter approached their table. She had dark hair and sharp eyes. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm Nina Cole from the Interstellar News Network. Would you comment on your relationship? Our viewers are fascinated by your story." Jack began to refuse, but Lyra placed her six-fingered hand on his arm. "What story do you think you know?" she asked the reporter. Nina smiled. A human soldier rescues an alien child. Years later, they find each other again. It's quite romantic. "It's not romantic," Jack said firmly. "It's about humanity. About doing the right thing even during war. And about gratitude," Lyra added. "About remembering kindness and trying to return it to the universe." The reporter studied them. "Would you share your full story? It might help people understand." Jack and Lyra exchanged looks. Perhaps this was a chance to change the narrative. The next day, the story appeared across all networks. The soldier and the diplomat. How war created an unlikely friendship. The article told their story honestly. The rescue, the promise, the years of searching, the chance reunion. It included the photograph from the refugee camp and new pictures of them at the commemoration. But the results were not what they expected. Their comm units flooded with messages, some supportive, many hostile. Human security officials questioned Jack more aggressively. The Vordax diplomatic corps sent formal notice that Lyra's position was under review. "They're treating our friendship like a threat to peace," Jack said that evening when they spoke via a secure channel. "It makes no sense." "Fear rarely makes sense," Lyra replied. "But we cannot let them win. Our story is important precisely because it challenges their fear." As they talked, an official message arrived for both of them. The Interstellar Coalition Council requested their presence at an emergency session the next morning. "What do we do?" Jack asked. Lyra touched the medallion bracelet on her wrist. "We go together. We tell the truth, just as we have always done." That night, neither slept well. 10 years to find each other again, only to face separation, because their friendship made others uncomfortable. The Interstellar Coalition Council chamber was a perfect circle. Representatives from 12 species sat in rising tiers around the central speaking floor. Viewing screens showed the proceedings to audiences across known space. Jack and Lyra stood together in the center, feeling small under the gaze of so many important people. "This emergency session will now begin," announced the council chairperson, a tall human woman with silver hair. "We are here to address concerns about the relationship between security consultant Jack Miller, formerly lieutenant in Earth's military, and cultural attaché Zetheria, also known as Lyra, of the Vordax diplomatic corps." A Vordax council member spoke next. "This friendship raises security concerns. Both have access to sensitive information. Both served opposing sides during the war. It also violates diplomatic protocols," added a human representative. "Unofficial contact between security personnel and foreign diplomats must be approved in advance." Jack and Lyra exchanged glances. The situation seemed worse than they had feared. Their simple reunion might cost them their careers, their futures. "The accused may speak," said the chairperson. Jack stepped forward first. 10 years ago, I found a young Vordax girl trapped in a ruined building during the final days of the war. I could have followed protocol and sent her to a detention center. Instead, I took her to a refugee camp, visited her when I could, and promised to find her again someday. He looked at Lyra standing beside him. That promise wasn't about politics or species. It was about being human in the best sense of the word. Lyra spoke next, her voice clear and musical in the quiet chamber. I was that scared child. I had lost everything. My parents, my home, my future. Jack Miller showed me kindness when I expected only cruelty. He gave me hope that peace was possible. She raised her wrist, showing the medallion bracelet. I kept this to remember that promise. When I became a diplomat, I chose to serve on Earth because of what that one human had taught me, that bridges can be built even across the widest divides. The chamber remained silent. Then, unexpectedly, a voice called from the viewing area. I wished to speak. A middle-aged Vordax male stepped forward. My name is Krell. During the war, I was injured in an attack. A human medic named Sam Green treated me despite orders to prioritize human wounded. He saved my life. We have remained friends for 9 years. Then another voice. I am Elena Vasquez. A Vordax scientist helped me escape a research station under attack. We still exchange messages on our birthdays. More voices joined, humans and Vordax, sharing stories of connection that had remained hidden until now. Small acts of kindness during the war. Friendships maintained in secret. Children from one species adopted by families of the other after losing their parents. The council members looked at each other in surprise. The chairperson called for order. It seems, she said slowly, that the case before us is not unique. Perhaps it is only unusual because it became public. After hours of discussion, the council reached a decision. Jack and Lyra were cleared of any wrongdoing. More importantly, the council announced the creation of a new initiative, the Bridges Program, designed to document and support connections between former enemies. And we ask, said the chairperson, that Jack Miller and cultural attaché Zith Area serve as the first representatives of this program. Their story should be shared, not hidden. Outside the chamber, Jack turned to Lyra. I didn't expect that ending. Lyra smiled. We are not the only ones who built bridges. We were just the first to do it openly. So what happens now? Jack asked. Now we do what we promised long ago. Lyra said, we find others like us. We show that peace isn't just about treaties and politics. It's about people connecting across differences. Jack nodded. From soldier and refugee to Bridges representatives. It's a strange journey. But we travel it together, Lyra said, touching the medallion on her wrist. As promised. Around them, others from the hearing gathered, humans and Vordax with their own stories of connection, ready to build new bridges together.